So our first lecture was Vanessa Siddle Walker's lecture on Black educators during the Brown case, and basically, like, she was trying to bring a narrative or like a voice to Black educators during that time. I feel like much of what we know about the Brown lecture has a lot to do with like the the plaintiffs and like the people who went on the stand and the NAACP, but very little is said about like the Black educators who were there and were active participants. And I think she's right. I mean, I think the lecture was great and like bringing a voice to these people, just because like for myself at least, I never actually thought of Black educators during the Brown case. I was always like thinking like, were there even, I knew there were Black teachers obviously because these segregated schools, but I didn't think they like played a major role, and actually they did. She brings attention to the fact that the NAACP just brought publicity to the problem, that it was the educators who actually organized and made the case kind of, and brought up these plaintiffs. And yeah, she outlines a lot, and it just seems like, I don't know, like a underground like scheme in a way of like these Black educators, of how like they were having this dialogue about segregations in schools, and just about the fact that there was very little equality slash equity for these students long before the NAACP even like touched the subject. I don't know if you want to jump in, Camille.
It was just really interesting because I didn't think about like she like talks about these hidden voices and how they lost their voice, but for some of them it was voluntary because they were also in danger. Like they couldn't necessarily have said as much as they did like on the stand or in front of publicity, so it was like a background. Like Lorraine was saying, she talks about how organized, and like without this organization the Brown case probably would not have gone the way it was, because the teachers did everything from even providing the lawyers with the plaintiffs that they needed. And like I thought it was really interesting when she was talking about the different connectors and how there was all this like backroad stuff that like was kind of cool. Like you would drive 2 hours, go pick someone up, drive 2 more hours, drop them off, a different car would meet you, pick them up, and then like that lawyer, that person would go talk to parents to find out what the parents needed, and then it would all go back to like to the NAACP. And it was also really interesting. She talks a lot about the North and the South, and how the teachers went as far like in the South to go and like ask these associations, like, we want to be held to the same standards as white schools, knowing that they would have to give them the same resources if they were to be held to the same standards. So it was kind of this like sneaky way of getting what they needed, but being like, oh no, we don't want to integrate. But she says they were setting their students up for this, like this world that didn't exist. And it was really interesting because she was a Black professor. So she was talking about how back, like, 30 years before this world even existed for Black educators and Black academics, they were setting their students up to be in positions like she was, where she was lecturing at the Brown like conference. But, 30 years before or whatever, that never would have happened, and how just crazy it was that they had made sure to, like, all of this stuff was going in that you didn't even think about, but it was to make it an even playing field almost, and prepare them for integration, prepare them for all of these things that wasn't even in the works yet, but they knew eventually it would be, so they needed to prepare their students.
And then at the end, she kind of makes like this kind of note on the fact that the Black educators had like a pedagogical quest plus like an equity agenda. And then it just like, I don't know, like at that moment, everything connected to me. Like during the lecture, I was just like, it just makes sense. Like, yes, we want equality, and like the process during the day-to-day of like bringing these children up to the same standards as white students and up to like their full potential or whatever. But we also want them to have the classroom, like a good classroom climate, and like parental guidance and all these other things that are kind of just like, I don't know, like pushed to the side kind of when you're trying to like push like an equity agenda. Yeah, so what else?
I really want to read the book she was talking about. It's called The Guide to Developing an Inclusive Integration Plan from 1970, and it was in Georgia Teachers and Education Association's like book that they made for this big plan that would blanket the country for Black schools, so they were all on the same level and held to the same standards. And it was super interesting. But I also like that when she was talking about how you can't teach a child that you don't know. So it's like your responsibility to go in and get to know the teachers, get to know the students, get to know the parents, because you can't teach someone unless you understand where they're coming from.
Yeah, going off of that, there was like this part where I think it was like in the same phrase, kind of where she goes like that the Black educators during that time understood like that the teacher's main responsibility was like to meet the parents and the students where they were. And it just like reminded me of the reading with the student Derek, where like the teacher was kind of like, you know, like taking a step back from her responsibility and being like, you know, it's on, like, you didn't show me this, so like it's another year, my bad. But at this point, like, she makes a really, I don't know, for me it was profound, because it was just like, even back then, like that was a standard for teachers. Like, you should be meeting your students and their parents wherever they are. And it goes back to what you were saying about just like bringing that person back and forth with the parents. That shows like how dedicated they were to that. So yeah.
She talked about expectations and standards, and how you have to think about how like the standards and expectations you would have for your own child needs to be the standards and expectations you have for your students, because
Right.
everyone deserves to reach their full potential, but they can't do that if you're not putting in the work and having just as high expectations for them as you would someone else.
Yeah, so then she closes off basically by saying that that Brown was awesome. Like, it was obviously no segregation, great, but basically that the whole integration plan failed. How basically most of the boards were still predominantly white, and they were just like, you know, all right, I guess we have to kind of follow the rules. So we'll, like, MLK was like, you know, we're not talking about adding a little bit of color. Like, we're talking about fully like integrating us into everything, like into the schools, but also into the boards. Like, we have to have a direct play at how these schools are handled and how education is handled as a whole. Yeah, it was interesting.
Just to refer to the questions from your guys' understanding, what are the frameworks or the paradigms that they're talking about?
I would definitely say, like, I don't know if this is like in the right area, but I saw a lot of like critical race theory when they were talking about just like the study in general, when she was just referring to it. That's the one that stood out to me.
Yeah, I would say I don't know, like, I feel like critical is like, you're kind of, according to like the research she did, because I mean, she did most of her research off of basically all of these things left behind by another professor, I think it was. So I don't feel like she had like a direct like play kind of. So I would say, like, I don't know, it kind of like, I'm like hesitant to say this, but like it kind of reminded me of like an old paradigm, like probably like the positives or like the post positives. Like, I don't know, like it didn't strike me as like a new paradigm, because she was basically like just reading stuff and making connections. She kind of wasn't like involved in anything really.
So it's more like an analysis, like a literary analysis.
She found all of these records in an old school, like in a part of a school that had been rebuilt. She found a back area that had like just like thousands of records and transcripts, and that's where she got all of her research.
Wow.
Yeah, and like just talking about the things that were left behind just reminded me how like the Black educators didn't record any of like what they wrote or like wanted to say or anything, because they really wanted no parts, or like they wanted like no credit for this. It's kind of like crazy. I don't know. Like I feel like maybe like in our culture as it is right now, like, you know, you want credit for everything. And they were just like, no, like they didn't even write anything. And like as an educator, you know, like everything you write will be left behind. And even like if you don't get credit now, you'll get credit later. But they seem to be like kind of against that and just wanted like the NAACP to be the voice, basically.
Do you think it had to do with their personal safety, like you guys had mentioned before?
I think that's definitely a big part of it.
Yeah, she mentions that some educators from the North were like really afraid to go down South because they were like, one of their meetings was held down there and they were just like, we can get killed down there. Like, why would we go there? And then also after like the Brown case ended, a bunch of Black educators got fired. So they were like, she states that they were afraid for a reason, obviously. Like probably the reason they didn't want any credit was because they didn't want what happened to occur, which was that they got fired.
She talks about how the association even went as far as to insure some of their like teachers when they had to travel because they knew how badly their lives were at risk.
Like life insurance?
Yeah.
Is that that's crazy.
Because they were traveling somewhere where they really were going to be in danger.
Wow. That provides a really good context, I think, for just how dire the situation was and still is, but in a different way, I guess. But yeah, okay. And I think, and you guys did connect to the because the other question is, what are connections between lecture and youth voices from all the things that we read and watched this week? And Lauren, you talked about Derek.
Right.
That student.
I think about like A Girl Like Me, that little video, and how like Black identity and like all the way like Black identity is framed and like Black worth, and like that kind of hit me during that because you know, like it's kind of the job of a teacher, I believe personally, to tackle issues like this, for especially if you're in a classroom where this is like such an issue. So like, but if you think back to this time when they were holding their children to this high standard and like holding their students to the standard of like the white schools, which then were such a high standard, they were kind of like touching on this, you know, they're saying you still have the right to reach your full potential. So even though you're in a segregated school, we're going to make sure you know that you're worth it, because one day you'll have an opportunity. And it just like made me think like that video and how important it is to like show everyone that they are just as worthy as someone else.
Maybe that can be a good tool for us even to like, even just to think about like from the first day that we get in the classroom, what kind of environment and culture do we want to create? Yeah, that's really good. I'm interested that you said that that's the job of a teacher, because I feel like other people might say like, oh, the job of a teacher is just to teach. It's like teach like that, the actual literal content. And so I like that you incorporate that.
Like this week's assignments have really made me think about that too, because I was thinking about, you know, the life of an undocumented with that video too. And it immediately made me think like, I probably knew, because we had a lot of immigrants in our community, And so I probably knew a lot of undocumented immigrants that I didn't even think about. So I thought about immediately the way like conversations that were had in middle school, in high school, in classrooms framed these individuals, and how we might have had those students in our classroom and that could have really impacted them. So it made me a lot more aware. And then watching A Girl Like Me and then reading this study, I was like, okay, yeah, this all really super connects.
That's good.
I feel like this lecture brings a lot of attention to like the educators' voices, but I do feel like the educators were trying to stand in for the youth voices at that moment, because they were, not that the students at the moment didn't matter, but like I feel like she mentioned like at that point they weren't even considered fully human in a way. So it's just like, I don't think they were thinking about giving them a voice. They were just trying to at least get them like educational equality in a way. But she did mention at the beginning where like the original intent of like these Black educators was to like make sure that these children were being trained as intelligent individuals, like and like to be given a right to aspire and stuff like that. So I feel like this lecture definitely made it so that the voice of the youth was through the educators.
I think that's a good tie-in to what the lecture that I did, because it actually starts with like the first congressional meeting after the Civil War ended, so December 4th, 1865. And then it talks about the history up until like what you guys were talking about. But it talked about how like at first they had to deal with the 13th Amendment, which is counting people as actual people instead of 3/5 of a person. And that added 10 seats to the House of the Representatives, which a lot of people were really nervous about because they're like, well, we have 10 more seats in the South that are then going to continue to make it difficult to pass laws about equality. And then the 14th Amendment came about, and they tried to make it, Thaddeus Stevens tried that all nations and state laws would be equally applicable to every citizen based on no discrimination. But then someone else said they wanted it to empower Congress to pass all necessary laws to secure all persons in every state of the Union equal protection in their rights, life, liberty, and property. So because John Brigham like kind of changed what Thaddeus Stevens had said, they like this congressional meeting came up with this like mixture of the two that caused the segregation in our schools. So it gave schooling to African American students, but it didn't like give them integration into the schools. But they gave equal resources at that time to those students. So even though they were taught in all Black schools with only Black teachers, they didn't have like resource deficits like we do later on. So most people voted in favor for this. And then he starts talking about the Black Belt in Alabama, which is named for the Black soil that they have, as well as the African American population there. And then he talks about how in 1877, Black teachers were actually paid more than white teachers, which I thought was a really interesting fact. And then in 1915, white teachers were like paid astronomically more than Black teachers. And this all changed with the 1901 convention, where they replaced the equal benefit of all children with just and equitable. And one congressman said that it's not about justice, it's about making sure whites get more funding than Black students, because that's what justice is. And I was like, that's disgusting, but okay, that's what you said. And so this is 1901. So yeah, like things actually went worse from 1866 to 1901. So like things were going well in 1866 for the most part. Like we were still in segregated schools, but they were getting equal funding and they were getting teachers that understood where they were coming from for the most part, and they were like actually succeeding as students. And then he started talking about the population that was registered to vote. And in the Black Belt, there were some parts where 0% of the African American population was registered to vote in the 1960s because they had changed the laws based off of who could register to vote. And then he started talking about how like there was a ton of voter fraud for white voters because over 100% of the white population, so like more than there were actual people, were registered to vote, which like is totally not cool. It's like the worst example of voter fraud that he could find. And it like eliminated 38,000 jobs for African Americans once they left more power up to the state in 1984 and 89. And then in 1973, there were only 3 Black principals remaining out of the 203 that were there prior to those years. So yeah, it was kind of sad to listen to this talk because it was like we were doing fairly well up until this point, but then 1901 totally changed everything. And then he started talking about how nowadays you need certain identification to vote. And most African Americans, it's like 1 in 4 do not have that proper identification. 1 in 5 Asian and Latino or Latina people do not have that appropriate ID. So like even though they want to vote and they have the education to vote and they have like been living here, they just don't have like one piece of paper that says that they can vote. So their voice isn't heard, which is like a huge part of our population that is being pushed aside and said like, no, we don't care. And so yeah, that he mostly was talking about how like we can't make changes if we're not listening to the voices of these people, which I think is a fair point. But there's nothing being done about getting the ID laws changed. And like since that like really bad example of voter fraud in the Black Belt, there's been like very, very few cases of actual voter fraud. So like we really don't need these strict procedures for like who can vote and what ID you need to bring with you because like it's really not relevant anymore. And I was like, cool, we're just doing this to be jerks.
Yeah, voter suppression, very real, very much reflected in this year's election. And besides voter fraud, I mean, obviously, I don't know if this is true, like, but this year there's also a lot of allegations of just election fraud as well. So it's very interesting how there's that kind of illusion of, you know, having a say in politics, and definitely for a lot of people of color in the U.S. today, it's really difficult to vote. But that, Valerie, did they talk about? So you talked a lot about like the like situations within schools, and what about like in terms of socially and economically, like the situation for Black people?
That wasn't really talked about, although they did talk about like overcrowding in some of the Black schools, but that was about it. It wasn't really talked about like where they were coming from socioeconomically, but I can't imagine it was very good because they were recently freed. So there was like the sharecrop movement and like all of the fun stuff that we did to try to continue to suppress African American people. Fun is used very sarcastically there. And yeah. So I think he just assumed that you knew that they weren't in a good place.
Yeah, that's definitely, they're freed. In my reading, there's like one part when, one of my pet peeves is when people say the Civil War was about race, because it wasn't. It was about states' rights, and race just happened to be, or slavery just happened to be like a good way for one side to try to win, to try to take a moral high ground, and it didn't do any, even it didn't really change the fates for a lot of people to end slavery, because it's still, there's still so many like horrific remnants of that today. So yeah. And it sounds like, Val, that's what your lecture you watched is kind of about.
Yeah, it was mostly just like how we're continuing to suppress the voice of people that should have an equal say in everything.
I'm kind of like wondering how true that is, that in 1877 Black teachers' pay was like higher than white teachers. Like kind of, I mean, I get if it was true, it makes sense, but like I don't know. It's
It
like,
could have been because they had more students, so they were being paid more, and they were, I don't know. That's just what the statistic that Dr. Anderson gave. So I was like, oh, I'm gonna write that down because that's interesting.
Yeah, that's so shocking.
yeah, I was just like, really? I mean, I feel like just that statistic, just like I don't know. I feel like it might be one of those things where it's just like, or maybe I'm just like processing it like that, where it's just like, oh, okay, so things were like fine back when, you know, everyone was minding their business, and then.
Well, I wonder if it's one of those things where they were paid more, but paid more in context, you know, like paid more based off of what the average income was.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so like technically money-wise, the other teachers were still making more, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Maybe it was something like that, because that did kind of, that shocked me a lot, because I've never heard that.
Yeah, it's really interesting how like one statistic, it can be used like so many different ways, because like here it sounds, or Val, correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like in that lecture it was being used to juxtapose like that things, you know what I mean, got like so much worse and whatever. But Lorraine, sounds like you're saying like it could be so easy for a different lecturer to say, oh, look, like things were totally like, you know.
Yeah, like things were fine, and then things went downhill because like they chose this, or it goes back to like the whole, I don't know.
It's like, who has the agency of what happened next? Yeah.
Yeah. It was, I don't think I wrote down his name, who said that it was like some congressman from Alabama, I believe, that said in the 1901 convention, like, that just and equitable instead of equal benefits of all children is not justice, that whites and blacks are getting the same thing. And I was like, come on. Like we in that like single line of this talk, like we digressed as a society like 1,000 years.
Yeah. Or I guess for them, only like 100.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I'm glad that we decided on this order, because I think, well, mine, it takes like all the context of what you guys talked about and like pushes it forward now and talks about like what has changed or like what did, but then quickly slid backwards. I wonder how much time we have left on this.
I think because they made us, I don't know about you guys, but I got an email telling me I was made a pro account. I don't think there's a...
Yeah.
Oh, there's no time limit anymore?
I think it's just gonna be one consistent stream.
I mean, I still think we should keep it to about like an hour max, but
yeah. Yeah, I just didn't want to like get cut off and be like, oh no, there's 1 minute remaining. You know. Okay, phew. I will not talk for a super long time, but yeah, so I I was supposed to watch, but I just had to read the transcript of the Orfield talk, and he's basically going over the legacy of the civil rights movement from then to now. And he's saying that like it was super dramatic. Like I had almost like laughed in the beginning of it because he opens and he's talking about like this. There's a statue of MLK in DC, and like if it was accurate, it would be crying because of what's happened since he was alive. But it was just like it's kind of like a dramatic piece, and him, you know, as an author and as a writer, it seemed he was very compelling. I'll put it that way. And so he starts off by saying that like the way we frame civil rights now, we learned that like, oh, that was a thing that happened and that race was a problem and that it was solved through civil rights. But he's saying that it would be more accurate to say that it wasn't a problem that was solved. It's like civil rights is something that has slowly been being abandoned because we kind of focused on it as a country for a very short amount of time and then didn't maintain that or really even address the real issues. And so he kind of goes through a lot of legal stuff, and he goes through a lot of Supreme Court cases and actions by presidents that kind of set that stage. But something I thought that was really interesting that he's talking about, then he's saying how at that time that race was really this binary of black and white, and that we had really low immigration at the time. And so one of the major issues he talks about is now, you know, we have this challenge of how do we expand civil rights? Well, first of all, how do we make civil rights something that does adequately address issues for African Americans in the US, but also how do we create civil rights for immigrants, because that's obviously a huge growing population for the United States. So and how do we address issues in school systems for English language learners? And so that's like a huge rights problem that we have now. But I thought it was really interesting. He was like, it's just always sickening kind of to hear what politicians blocked what. So he was saying that after the civil rights movement, that basically better and more long-lasting change was actually blocked by the Reagan administration because they hired this journalist to basically publish reports saying that everything was fine and that the civil rights movement was really successful for schools, and so everything was really going great when it wasn't. And so that was like kind of frustrating to read. And then that extended all the way into today. He talks about No Child Left Behind, which we talked about before. And I've always known that it's something that didn't work, but I didn't understand why. And so he points out that it didn't work because from the outset, the way that it was defined, No Child Left Behind didn't reflect on the fact that there's resource inequity for schools, and that there are also these underlying issues outside of schools. So it only focused on, it basically was saying like, let's solve this problem, but didn't make any like real significant changes to situations so that teachers or students or school officials or communities could actually solve this problem. So that was like very frustrating to read. And then it was basically saying for No Child Left Behind, like the deadlines were coming up for schools to meet this standard, and basically no school could do that. And so what they would do would be they'd restructure the standard so that like if teachers could meet that independently through testing, through another form of testing, then they could pass the standard. But schools who really couldn't do that were resource poor schools, and predominantly schools that served a lot of students of color. So from the outset, it didn't serve those communities. And then towards the end of No Child Left Behind, as they're racing to meet those standards, it really, really just drove these schools towards like testing models that didn't make sense for their students. And so that was really reminding me of another reading that I did this week. I think it was for the science content And so it was all about like culture and how culture is just a system of knowledge that we use to interact with each other and understand each other. And it had this great example about like testing culture in schools. And so the authors were teaching a course for, I think it was New York City exterminators. And basically it's like a certification course that helps you get a better job or whatever, better standard of living. And so only like 50% of these people could pass it the first time around. But they were saying that it's because they're not acclimated to this testing culture, but that doesn't mean that they're not very knowledgeable and very competent in other forms of culture that we might not necessarily be adequate in. So what they did was they had the students who were able to pass the exam the first time teach the other students how to take like test taking strategies that they used that kind of translated the test model into their own, not like language, but into like terms that they made more sense to their daily life. And then they also talked about how realistic are the standards that we like hold kids up to in school. How realistic are those to everyday life? So like in life, are you going to get to work and they'll be like, okay, there's a test today. You can't use your phone. You can't use your computer. You know, like in real life, you're able to like kind of crowdsource information. You're able to look things up. So I think that really made me, reading the Orfield lecture really made me think of that reading this week, because basically he's saying that we need to change our educational system so that it actually reflects not just the basically like white culture as it has like reflected and as it has, you know, it's really benefited white students, but he's saying that we need to change it to reflect culture of immigrants and different types of learners, and also that it needs to reflect the needs of resource poor communities. And then Orfield, he also talked about something that I don't know if we touched on, but it's really important, that the way public schools are funded is based on property taxes. And so what this does is it just guarantees that students who live in communities where properties aren't very valuable won't get a very resource-rich education. So he talks about like restructuring cities, and which is a huge deal, an educational system, so that that isn't true anymore. But so that is kind of interesting how, you know, you can only do so much to a curriculum or like to integrate a school, but if there aren't like the resources surrounding it in the community, and if there isn't the funding for a school, then it's not going to really make any difference in the lives of those students. So he basically is saying that he's calling for a new civil rights movement that actually addresses the underlying issues of inequity in education, social and financial issues, and that there needs to be the same kind of drive to solve these problems today, even more so than there was in the past, because obviously those things were quickly reversed. But this also made me think about one of my professors at NYU writes for The Guardian, and like a few weeks ago, he released this video in The Guardian, and it's all about, well, okay, this is very negative, but he was saying why he thinks Trump would win the election, why it would be very American. And so he's basically talking about, I personally hope that he is not right, but it's all about how it's very American to have an angry racist backlash against any type of progress in our country. And so basically in the video, he's saying like, oh, it would make sense because we've had a Black president for 8 years, and that like really mobilized people who do not like that. Hence Trump supporters. And so not all of them, but I'm going to go ahead and say most of them. And so basically for Orfield, it's kind of like the same thing where you're saying like we had the civil rights movement, but then it inspired a lot of backlash, especially from really conservative political administrations against that because they didn't want to, they wanted to sweep that under the rug and pretend like it wasn't a problem anymore. And he also talks about the war on drugs too, and how that is particularly harmful for communities of color. So basically he's recommending like these really intense social changes as a huge facet of solving inequity in schools. But that's really challenging too, because as educators, like you and I don't have control over that, you know, like we don't have control over how schools are funded or what's going on in the lives of our students. We can only like respond and you know, and maybe advocate politically like those teachers did, like Lorraine and Camille, like you guys were talking about. But that's so interesting how, like, is that our part of our job description, you know, to be active. I'll send you guys that Stephen Thrasher video because I just think he's a really good thinker, and I really liked having him as a professor. But don't get too bummed out because I don't think he's going to be right about Trump getting elected. Can you imagine?
I was having like this talk with like my boyfriend goes to medical school. Like most of his friends are like people of color that go to medical school, and that we were talking about, like, obviously they all have some sort of frustration about race. So like we were talking about like, what if Trump wins? And I'm just like, I don't know. Like, I think it would kind of be positive if he wins because it'll bring everything to light, like in that way that like your professor was saying, like, you know, like we can't just ignore the fact that, yeah, Obama like won for 8 years, fine. But like, there's so much going on right now. Like we just can't ignore that. And they were so mad at me. Like I was basically like, I felt like did not want to make it like a issue about being a woman, but I just felt like completely like, I quieted down, and I wish I would have had that presentation, like that your professor's video.
Yeah, I mean, but that can be an ongoing discourse. You can come back to them and say like, hey, I wish I had also, but also, you know, like that is a real issue that sometimes you're talking to a group of guys and, you know,
Yeah.
they don't, it is a gender thing that, that some people don't want you to talk, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So.
Going back to like what you said about like the structures of our cities and how like they like kind of like tell you like what kind of education a child's gonna get. I remember growing up, I went to an elementary school that for me was great because, you know, compared to cities, to schools in the South Bronx, I live in the North Bronx, so like compared to city schools in the South Bronx, it was a good school. So my cousins who lived in the South Bronx, their moms would put them as if they lived in this apartment so that they can go to the school I went to. And in reality, our school was still horrible. Like when you look at like the resources and the funding that school was getting, and it was a good school. It was a decent school to us. So it just like made me think of that. And then I worked at a charter school in the South Bronx this past year, and the same thing was happening where people were just like, they would tell me like, do you think I'll get in trouble if I change my child's address so that like he can be put in the lottery? And I'm just like, I don't know, but I understand why they're trying to do that, because if they keep their address, they're going to go to an even worse school. Like the fact that they can even go into like a lottery for a charter like means a lot to a lot of parents in like urban communities. And it just, I don't know, it just like brings me to think about how dysfunctional some charter schools are, where like this type of equality and equity that they're supposed to be reaching by being a charter school are not being met at all. And they're actually like, I don't know, kind of working against the child.
Wow.
It'll be interesting for me to be involved with charter schools because we don't really have those here.
Oh, really?
Schools don't exist on this side of the country. It's like public, private, or homeschool. And there's actually been like a few movements to get charter schools out here, but people say like a lot of people are against it because they think it's gonna take away from their ability to homeschool their kids. So it keeps getting rejected.
I mean, I feel like there's like a whole spectrum of charter schools. Like, Michelle, I don't know if you've like been to like worse charter schools, but like Brooklyn Prospect is like literally seems to me like the heaven of charter schools. Like I'm just like, oh my God, literally, seriously. I keep talking to my coworkers about this. I'm just like, you do not understand. Like, this is actually a school. Like, you guys I wish I could take you on a tour of like the school I work at right now. It's terrible.
Can you?
I don't know. I wish I could. I'm gonna like. It's just like terrible for the students though. It's just I can deal with like, or like us as teachers, like we can deal with like everything they put on us, but it also makes it so hard to even like advocate for your students because you're so like dug into like another set of problems with like administration and like all these other tedious things that you can't even like be there for your students. It's so terrible. And for them, it's even worse for the students. So yeah, Brooklyn Prospect is like, oh my God. Like when they gave us a sweater, I was like, oh my God, what is going on? Like
a sweatshirt. Well, so I have a friend who's a high school teacher there. And that's how I like found out about this program because she was like, she always talked positively about the school because she started working there like 2 years ago. And I was like, okay, you know, like this sounds good. So I knew that she liked it. And she had worked in private schools for like 8 years beforehand. But yeah, it's definitely like, I'm glad that you are able to help us like get a view of what a charter school is like, because you already have that experience. It's really helpful for us to think about what do we have to keep in mind when we enter our classrooms and when we are approaching the bureaucracy of school, like what should we expect in terms of like difficulties, you know, that's tough. But yeah, I guess I think it definitely, even though like that's not a positive thing to expect, like it is just good to think about like what might be impediments to us serving our kids well, because inevitably like we won't be able to perfectly, you know, help them and like change everything in their lives, and that could be like a personal disappointment too, you know. So it's good to like anticipate those and think about that.
This is kind of off topic, but like one thing that I keep thinking about is like this is the Olympics year as well as the election year. And I always think it's like interesting that those always fall on top of each other because it's every 4 years for both. And how like everyone is like, oh my gosh, support the team, support America. And like, let's get behind all of these like different athletes, and how there's like a reality show about Gabby Douglas's life now. And then like 2 months later when we have the election, it's like, never mind, we don't care about the Black Lives Matter movement or anything else that has to do with like people that fall under different categories and what I do. But like prior to that, when they were supporting America and making us look good, we're going to support them.
Wow. I never thought of it that way.
This was like what I was thinking about late last night while I was trying to go to sleep. I was like, it's Olympics year and an election year at the same time. And like, this is so screwed up.
Yeah. How do you harness that like intense nationalist movement that exists here for something positive, for celebrating diversity? I don't know.
I also like, my family is really into watching the conventions. So we watched all of the Republican convention, and then my family's been watching the Democratic convention. And my dad is like, I'm realizing how incredibly nationalist and incredibly racist my dad is, which is really frustrating because like like, he's not like outwardly racist. Like, he would never be like, I don't like this person because of their race. But it's like very subtle things. So he's like, oh, I was talking to this person, they can't speak English because they're Black. And I'm like, no, that is not okay. But
Yeah.
he's like lately been going off about how like there are no American flags at the Democratic National Convention, and how like what nation are they even supporting if they can't even fly the American flag. And I'm like, okay, maybe they're just the decorators that they hired just like didn't want to put flags everywhere because that looks kind of tacky. But he was like, well, the Republican convention, like people were like had flag hats and like Uncle Sam hats and everything. And I was like, okay, well, they're different parties. They don't want to address themselves as the same thing. But
Yeah.
I don't know. It's just been getting growingly frustrating being at home because I'm realizing like I was brought up to think awful things.
Mm.
And like it wasn't until college that I even started questioning some of those things. And
That sounds really tough to grapple with.
yeah, it really is.
That's how I feel sometimes when my best friend, she's so wonderful, but her parents are not amazing in terms of that stuff. And sometimes I'm talking to them and I'm just like, oh, like her dad, when we were graduating, there's like a Latinx student graduation. And he was like, oh, like, are you so excited to graduate? I was like, yeah, there's this awesome graduation thing, ceremony. And he goes, oh, you're playing the Hispanic card? And I was like, and I didn't know what to say because they're like hosting me in their house, you know, and they always say stuff like that. And I'm always like, how do you, like, I think about what you're saying is like, yeah, these like microaggressions, like, how do you address that in a way that's not being like, you're racist because you said that, because that is not helpful. But so I'm always like trying to think about what is a good way to like to talk to somebody about like our vocabularies that we use for describing diversity, and like what are good ways to yeah, just say like, oh, that makes me uncomfortable, what you said, you know, that's awkward.
Dad's latest thing has been the other day he like called someone retarded, and I was like, you can't do that. That's not okay. We've talked about this multiple times. Like, it's not that you just have never been told that that's not okay. Like, you've been told multiple times that that's not okay, and you're continuing to do that because you just don't care. And then like last night, Joe Biden used the word malarkey in his speech. He was like, that's just a bunch of malarkey. And I was like, who uses that word anymore? And he's like, yeah, it's up there with retarded. And I'm like, no, those aren't even anywhere related. Like, you are choosing to just be a jerk. Like, I don't know. It's getting very frustrating in my household.
Yeah, that definitely sounds frustrating.
And like, I love my dad, don't get me wrong, he's a great guy for the most part. It's just when it comes to little things like bigotry, which is not a little thing at all, he is kind of a jerk.
Yeah, I mean, my dad's like pretty dark, and he still says stuff sometimes where I'm like, but it's a product of how he grew up, because his parents were like, we know we look different, so we have to make sure you dress white, you talk white, like everything you do makes you fit in. So he'll say, like, when Mike Brown died, my dad was like, oh, well, he was just like a young thug, whatever. And I was like, do you hear yourself like talking about this? Like, somebody could have easily said that about you, and you're like the nerdiest dude ever, you know? Like, it's really interesting how it's like a rhetoric that comes from like a certain time, and you know how people were raised, and it's hard to grapple with that. And yeah, when it's like your parent, and I hate having to have those conversations with him and to say like, that's wrong, you know, because he's had more lived experiences than me. But you know what, that's what they sign up for as a parent. If you have kids, one day they're going to go to college and come back and
Tell you you're wrong about everything.
I used to get into such heated like debates with my family that like when I stayed Running Start. Do you guys have Running Start on the East Coast? So here we get an option at 16. If you can test into college level, you get 2 years of college for free at the local community college.
Wow.
So at 16, I started college and I got my associate's degree when I graduated high school. So I started going to college classes and getting that kind of exposure at 16. And so I started coming back and like talking all crazy and being super heated about things. And so they always start laughing and they call me like the little activist in the family, because I was always on some new, like someone would expose me to why something was wrong. And then all of a sudden it was like so important to me to like make sure everyone else knew too. But I always think about that because like I'm always getting so frustrated and I'm like, nope, we can't do that.
They called you the little activist. Wasn't that like kind of belittling though? Because like,
Probably.
I mean,
Yeah, I have like the same like the scenario at my house. Like everyone thinks I'm like, well, my dad literally calls me crazy because like literally because I mean when I went to Fordham, and that's like a huge private university, and I came from like a small South Bronx high school, so it was a huge culture shock for me. I think I've told you guys that before, but like basically I came back and I had like this frustration, like you guys don't understand what quality education is, and now while my peers are here, I'm like here and I'm busting my ass to try to like match, and they were just like, oh, but you gotta get over it. I'm like, that's not the point. Now it's like everything is so much harder for me. Like even at this point, I'm like, and I was like talking about this with like my cousins, because I'm just like, so do you ever get those moments where you're like, do I really deserve to be here? Like you're like, oh my God, like I did not get the same education that other people at this level got, and I don't know, like, do I really need to be here right now? So I had these huge arguments with my parents, and then it came down to like, they always think I'm saying things because of color, and I'm just like, okay, it's not color, it's just that now I'm really aware of why my experiences were the way they were, and I'm making you aware of that as well, and you just don't want to, give me the reason, because then you'll be wrong. And it's just like, it's so frustrating. Like this whole, like just reading about these things in this class, I'm just like, I can't believe these are actual things. Like my feelings are completely validated right now. Like I'm just like, this is why I felt that way. This is why I still feel this way. But yeah, it's just so hard to make parents like just, I get it. Like even when they're educated, like my mom is a math whiz and I suck at math, but like, it's just like, I don't know. I feel like even when we have children, this will probably happen, but I'm not saying I'm smarter than you. I'm just saying like, these are point of views I've gotten. I just want to like mix you in somewhere. Like, I don't know. It's just really tough. So yeah, I can like imagine it's tough for all of us, like regardless of our backgrounds. Like, it's just tough to like with parents in general. You're like, I love you, but why?
But I'm glad that we can all like kind of share that and like support each other in that, because yeah, it starts at home, and it's always tough talking to somebody when you know that they won't agree with you. So that's something that's good for us to practice. Yeah. Do you guys want to end so that it's not over 60 minutes? And
Yeah. I think we're over by like 2, but
we love to talk, and I love talking to you guys. This is such a good conversation. But maybe we'll continue it. Maybe if we want to continue it, we can message each other and stuff.
Okay.